So dear friends, can you hear? So welcome to a class that has been going on since the spring on the 40 tenets of Plum Village practice. And this also is online, so people have been following. And for those of you online, we're just starting the Rains Retreat, the Vasa here at Deer Park. So we have a lot more people here. So welcome. So we'll start with 3 sounds of the bell. Just come back to our breathing. And really just relax our body. Aware of any tension in our body. Just allowing it to open up, and we can smile. Practicing dwelling happily in the present moment. So, dear respected Thai, dear noble community, today is the 20th, I think, of October, and we're in our first week of the winter rains retreat at Deer Park. The brothers had a gate walk this afternoon, and Thai Phap Luu and myself and Brother Min An were a little bit late. They left. You guys left on time, and so we were walking. When we got to the gatehouse, we could see this mass of people walking down the road, and we thought, "What is this? Is this a riot, or what's going on here?" It's been more than a year, maybe 2 years, almost a year and a half. We've been in the pandemic, and it's hard to describe what it feels like to have so many, especially young people here, practicing, living together, building community. This is I can feel Thai smiling in me. Maybe, is it really loud? Maybe we can, yeah. Thai's deep aspiration, his whole life as a monk, is to build community. I remember looking at drawings he made. Many of you might know our teacher, his passport was rendered invalid after he spoke out about the war in Vietnam in the West, and he could not return to his country. And so during those years he took care of his own practice and had a chance to travel and visit places where he, like in this case it was Thailand, and he made all these sketches of the layout of communities in Thailand. He was very curious about the very simple villages where people put their huts and how the doors relate to each other, where is the gathering place for the community, where is the cooking place, yeah. Where do you poop and pee, all these things. I really was curious. And even before that, many of you know, you have heard of the School of Youth for Social Service that our teacher founded along with Sister Shen Kong in the 60s. It was a youth movement, young people living together in near Phap Luu Temple in Saigon, and training to go out to the countryside, to very poor areas, and winning the trust of the people there just by their willingness to teach the children, to maybe bring a little bit of soy milk or something to eat for the children when the parents were working in the fields. And actually, Thai wanted to start in an experimental village in the countryside. I'm not sure if they found a piece of land, but he wanted to study like medicine, simple medicine, how to build composting toilets. I was very curious, how can we live together? How can we learn to, as human beings, especially live together in harmony? We can figure out all the physical stuff, right? The toilets and showers and food, and where to sleep, how to stay warm. But how can we actually live in harmony with each other? That is a big question. And so Deer Park is one of those experiments. And I think maybe Sister Hung Nim knows better than me, but I think this is the largest number of lay friends we've had at Deer Park. Yeah, I'm just coming back from Plum Village, so to me it's a little bit normal. I think before the pandemic, we would have about 60 to 70 young men in Upper Hamlet who would stay for the 3 months. And but I heard at Deer Park this is new, so thank you for your practice. Thank you for coming here and taking a risk, actually. Being with all these weird monks and nuns. Like, what are we doing here, right? So I felt very, very joyful inside to see all of you walking down the road en masse. Tai often said that there's nothing higher than, I guess we call siblinghood now, but he said brotherhood. Nothing higher than brotherhood and sisterhood. So if in our practice of Buddhism, we break the brotherhood and sisterhood, we need to look more deeply and see if something in our practice of Buddhism is not quite right. And so that is our aspiration for the Rains Retreat, is figuring out, like, okay, now I got these new roommates, one of them snores, one of them is coughing, one of them's this, that, right? And can I sort it out? Can I learn how to, this one, he leaves the bathroom really smelly when he comes out, or whatever, It's like you start to pick up all these cues and start to to have perceptions about each other. And so, see if you can look deeply and try to look at each other always with fresh eyes. Not to let those perceptions set in and become, solid in you, but rather let it flow. Yeah. So look at your sisters, look at your brothers. Like, oh, wow, what a wonder! What a miracle! This body. It's like all kinds of microbes and bacteria and growing. I mean, so recently I learned that if we just say the cells in our body that are merely, say, human, it would only be kind of one leg up to the knee in terms of biomass. So most of our body is actually not non-human cells, right? There's all kinds of bacteria and fungi, all kinds of things. So rather than just settling for the kind of a small set of boring perceptions or annoying perceptions or maybe pleasant perceptions about each other, see if you can bring that freshness to every time you see another person in the monastery. Like, wow, what a wonder is this person. It's really constantly changing, constantly growing, constantly evolving, living organism. And this, do I really know anything about this person? Or spider. So that's the spirit of practice and building community. And for sure there will be conflicts in this winter retreat. For sure there will be moments when we feel like, I'm sick of it, I want to go home. So just look into that. And take refuge in those of our friends who've been on the path for a while. Like we have here Joanne, Dhamma teacher, there's Kenley. I know Nina has been here before for winter retreat. And how many others of us have been here for the winter retreat before? Yeah, I think a few of us. Yeah, and Nikolai, of course. So please, learn to take refuge in the Sangha. Don't just hold it inside. That's one of the biggest lessons I've continuously had as a monk, learning to circulate my difficult emotions. Doesn't mean that I just bah! I vomit it out onto my brothers and sisters, but rather I let it flow, and I find someone, I establish a relationship, and then I say I can share with that person. But I share in a way that I'm very aware that these are my perceptions, and I'm working with it. I'm working to transform it. So it's not in the spirit of blaming or judging. So that's a kind of training. So we recognize that our suffering, most of it is created by our own mind, our attachment to our perceptions. And if it's okay, it's normal, because within us there is something like a fish, something like a reptile, something like a chimpanzee, and that tendency to kind of jostle a bit for position, for role, for trying to impress somebody, to make them our partner, this kind of thing. And just, even if you're a monk or a nun, that's still, I can tell you, it's still there. Even if you take a vow of celibacy, all, the animal nature, I mean, we are animals, right? But this is, our ancestral nature is there. And so learning to see that our perceptions are not completely correct. That's a starting point. And then the more and more you look into it, you see how they're just a tiny, tiny approximation of how things really are. Right? But at the beginning, sometimes we're so sure about our perceptions that it's okay. To start, you can say, maybe you can accept that your perceptions are not completely correct. And then slowly you start to see, oh my gosh, they're really, really, really off. And as I've noticed, as I deepen in my practice, that I see just to what extent I have just this tiny window on the world. And it's what I think of as the world. But actually, the more that I see that, the more that I have understanding and compassion. I see that that person, she said that thing, she did that thing because she's suffering, right? Or maybe her mother, her father, her ancestors are manifesting in that moment, and there's an ancestral suffering that is coming out. And so I just can give rise to compassion and understanding instead of getting angry or irritated or judging. And that is the basis of community. So good luck. Yeah. So in 2006 to 2007, our teacher gave these teachings, which we now refer to as the 40 Tenets of Plum Village. And I was just a recently ordained bhikshu. Actually, I was still a novice when he started teaching it. And we were learning about the mainstream schools of Buddhism and the different kinds of views that arose in geographically separated schools of Buddhism within India and around the beginning of the Common Era. And after looking into those different points of view that had arisen in different schools of Buddhism, then Thai asked a question, so how does Plum Village relate? What are the things that our community has realized or had insights about in the Buddhist tradition to offer to the world? And so these 40 tenets are Thai's contribution to 2,600 years of the Buddhist tradition. So his deep looking as a monk for over more than 70 years as a monk, and also his deep aspiration to update and renew Buddhism. If we're not careful, even those things that bring us the most happiness, we can take them for granted. And we just we say, I'll make more time to practice. But I'm just happy the Buddhist tradition is there and the Buddha taught, and that's my spiritual path. But if we're not careful, Thai used to say, when we ordain as a monk or we just come to the practice, the Buddha is there in our heart, and then every year he gets a little bit farther and farther away. And then after 10 years, the Buddha is way over there, and there are all these other things, all of our projects, all of our, the things of our life as a monastic or as a practitioner. And the Buddha is there, but maybe we put him away in a box. So we have to be very diligent and very vigilant and look and see, am I just going through the motions? Or am I really, experiencing joy in my practice? And so these 40 tenets are ways in which Thai saw in the Buddhist tradition that sometimes, we may have gotten a bit lazy or a bit caught in a view or a dogma that is actually not helping us to wake up, to be free from our notions and concepts. And so actually one of the novices here, who's now a bhikshu, asked me, I shared about it a little bit when I was visiting Deer Park a couple of years ago, and then he said, well, would you continue that class? And so it's kind of morphed into this. And but it's a lot of fun because we get to do this together. We get to kind of look into it and really get into the core of Thay's insight and into the practice. And so I made photocopies of the 40 tenets to give to you, because I know maybe that might not be easy for you to get it online, but I'll give it out at the end. And yeah, so has anybody been following the class online? Oh, a few of you. Okay, great. So we're going to kind of just dive right into it. We're actually going into a whole new area of the 40 tenets today, starting with the 20th one. A real Arhat is also a Bodhisattva. And a real Bodhisattva is also an Arhat. So it can be a little bit shocking if you know a little bit about Buddhist history. In the time of the Buddha, as monks deepened their practice and they were able to cut off all their afflictions, the Buddha recognized them as an Arhat. And this term can mean many things. So it can mean one who is worthy. Of offering. So the monastic community depends on generosity in order to survive. So the food that we eat here is thanks to people coming here to practice, and you make a contribution, or some people come up with bags of rice, or like recently we had a lot of grapes in the cooler in Solidity Hamlet. So we decide that we're not going to work for money in our life, but rather we're going to completely take a vow of poverty by only having a few requisite things. And then of course there's the material that's in the sangha, in the community, that we make use of, like these cameras, flowers, plants, doesn't belong to any of the monks or nuns, but it's part of the monastery. And we consider ourselves just stewards of these things. It's also of this land here at Deer Park. We don't, of course there's a legal entity that owns the land, the Plum Village community of engaged Buddhism, but there's no monk or nun who owns Deer Park. It is set up in such a way that we are only just caring for it like a garden. And so in that way, for example, when the Buddha went into Rajgir, where the King Bimbisara at that time was living, and he met the king, and the king was so impressed by the Buddha's teaching and by his presence that he right away offered one of the most precious pieces of land there in Rajgir, the bamboo grove. And he said, I want to offer it to the Tathagata. So this class is a little bit about different names of the Buddha. So there's one name, Tathagata. Have you all heard this name? Yeah. Who hasn't ever heard this? Some of you. Okay. So Tathagata means it's actually two words. That means like you could say the thus come one, or Tata. Tata is like thus, or just such. It's just it's just like that. Yeah, nothing more, nothing less, just as it is. And this can actually be broken up in two different ways. It can be agata or tathagata. So agata means the coming, to come, or having has come, and gata means gone. So Tathagata it's kind of, it can mean either the one who has come just like that, the thus come one, or the one who is just gone like that. And this is it's a name that actually was used, was present in the time of the Buddha, as far as we can tell, in the spiritual communities that are there. And it's a kind of teaching in itself. So we know that in the Buddhist tradition, the Buddha taught about non-self. So we don't, if we get caught in our idea about who we are or who another person is, and we hold on to that as something permanent, we suffer, because actually when we look deeply, there's nothing permanent. There's only changing, evolving. This body, like I said, full of cells, bacteria, it's just a wonder of nature. And we know that every element goes back to the earth, to the air, and yet there's this awareness that is happening. Yeah, there's this experience that we all are having of being alive, of life. And so when one time when the Buddha was teaching a monk, he said, can you see the Tathagata in his form? And the monk said, no, I cannot see. I cannot say it is this finger, it is this foot, it is this eye that is the Tathagata. And he said, well, can you see it in the feelings? Like pleasant feelings, painful feelings. And he said, no, I cannot see the Tathagata in the feelings. And the same for the perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. There's nothing that we can say that is the Tathagata. And so this, it is like a name which helps us to see that there's no thing that we can say that is the Buddha. That is it. There is only the instantaneousness of the moment, of this experience, which is not something we can grasp onto. And so this is a way, an epithet, a name of the Buddha that helped people to not get caught in the bodily form of the Buddha, or in his feelings, his perceptions. Yeah. So Bimbasara said, I want to make an offering to the Tathagata of the bamboo grove. And the Buddha said, no, offer it to the Sangha in the 10 directions. Offer the Venuvana, which is the bamboo grove, to the Sangha in the 10 directions. And he said, with that gesture, that speech, he set a precedent for the Sangha until today. So any piece of land and all this property that we have here at Deer Park is offered to the Sangha in the 10 directions. It's not to Thai or just to the abbot or the abbess, but it's actually to any piece of land where there is a practice that is offered. It is offered to the Sangha. And so that is how the Buddhist community has continued for 2,600 years, creating spaces of practice on planet Earth that are, and we as monks, as nuns, as lay friends, we are just stewards of this space. We are there just to care for it, make sure that the living beings here feel safe, and that there is enough food and water for the monks and nuns and the lay friends who come here. But it's a different way of looking at it's land, property. There's free from ownership. And at the same time, we practice not to take what is not given. In the original 5 mindfulness trainings, we call the 5 precepts. There's one which is adina adatam. It means not taking what is not given. And this is very, very deep. It's a very deep practice. When we look into everything that we do in our actions of body, speech, and mind, we see that there is a kind of balance in the universe. And to what extent we are grasping on something, we take it, it's creating a little bit of imbalance. And then there's a kind of something that comes back when we do that. And so the monks and nuns, we are kind of living that in our daily life by letting go of a sense of ownership of things. I have this robe that was offered to me, and so I try to take care of the robe, but I don't get attached to it as an owner. I just see that this body needs clothing, and so I take care of it so that I can wear the robe. And you probably don't want me to stand up here naked, right? So anyway, but it's not, I don't get attached to it and think, oh, this is my robe, and why do you take somebody takes the robe, then I get angry. But if my brother takes it and he doesn't ask, then I'm more concerned about his practice. You see, that's a different thing. We want to see that when everything that we're doing while we're here during the Rains Retreat is in that spirit of adina adatam. So not taking what's not given. Yeah. So if we need something from the kitchen, or we need something from the linen closet, we go to that sister who's responsible, and we know that she's not the owner either. She's just the steward. But we practice. That's a kind of like beautiful relationship. We go to that person and we say, oh, can I get a sheet from the linen closet? And they say, of course. And then you can go and take the sheet and bring it to our room. Or if we
are feeling ill and we need to take some food from the kitchen, from the cooler, then we go to ask that sister who's the shopper, and we say, can I take that item? So this is retraining ourselves. Maybe we have that habit, we just live in our house and there's just a bunch of stuff everywhere and we just grab this and we grab that. I'm like, oh, nobody's using that, I'll just grab this. But then we lose our sense of stewardship and we become like a thief. We're just grabbing things, When somebody's not looking, we just... And that plays itself out not only in material things, but also in our speech, our bodily actions. We're looking for love, we're looking for appreciation from others, and it's kind of like, there's one image the Buddha said, it's like pulling the feathers off of a bird. It's like, ow, it's very painful. And when we take things which are not given, there's a kind of like, oh, like in the fabric of the universe that happens. So learning that balance of respecting the space and being a steward, if we are able to do it with the monastery, we're able to do it with our brothers and sisters here, then we start to be able to do it with our own clothing or things that we consider our own. And then actually you start to see that this body, these feelings, these perceptions, we're just stewards of them. They're not me, myself, or mine. And that is how we get deep into the training, because we see that even our thoughts are not me. And if I want to be a good steward of this body, these feelings, these perceptions, I need to practice letting go of my concepts like, these are my thoughts, this is my body, these are my feelings. And instead to see that we're just helping to guide, like a gardener, our mind. It's very fun. So Tathagata is not caught in his own body or feelings, perceptions. You cannot find the Tathagata anywhere. You try to find it, you cannot find him. Okay, so the Arhat is one who is worthy of offering. So when someone is practicing like that, when they balance, they reach this kind of practice. Sometimes we call it the practice of no practice, or the practice of non-practice. As new meditation practitioners, we come here and we think, oh, I want to practice this, I want to practice this, I want to go to sitting meditation, walking meditation, I want to do all the practices, right? And then over time, it just becomes integrated into our being, right? We are just stewards of this body, these feelings, and it's like a dance. We go, oh, I go to sitting meditation, walking meditation, but I'm not caught in the sitting meditation. When somebody comes in late or somebody starts coughing a lot during sitting, I don't like, why don't you quiet down? Right? You see, because you see, it's all just a play, it's a dance. Yeah? We're learning to relax, to put down all of that, the burden of our work, our family, the ancestral suffering that we may carry in us, and just engage in this beautiful play together. And when you do that, you are worthy of offerings. But because you're not attached to the offering. Yeah. So long as you keep grabbing on things, getting up on Amazon, I want that, order that. Sometimes I came to Deer Park and I see so many boxes of Amazon coming in. These boxes from Amazon. There's a little bit of and I have ordered things from Amazon, so full disclosure. But it's a little bit like now when I buy something, because as monks we have a little bit of pocket money, and I might buy something. But it's almost like, oh, it's so painful, when I buy it, because I know that I've created this a little bit of stickiness with this thing. And I have to take care of this thing, which is going to end up in a landfill. It's going to spend most of its existence on this planet in a pile of trash buried under the earth, probably. But it's going to have a short, brief, shiny existence in my room, basically. And so I'm kind of contributing to this landfill with this thing. And so I start to see that, oh God, it just becomes so painful to buy something. Because I just can already see its future, and I feel like I'm like that, like pulling the feather off of the bird. I'm causing a little bit of harm. Yeah. So that's really what I feel. I'm like, I really have to buy this thing. But when we can let go of it and just learn how to dwell happily in the present moment, that's when we get closer to this ideal of the Arhat. Yeah. So somebody comes up and gives us some food, somebody gives us some tea, somebody gives us this, and we are able to take it and then maybe just give it to somebody else. It's just like a beautiful dance, and there's no grasping. It's just like, oh wow, thank you, and then you turn around, you give it to somebody else. Yeah, because maybe you have enough tea, you don't have to hold on to it, you give it to your brother. And so this is kind of redistributed out into space and time. And that is a practice of an Arhat, just not taking what's not given. Another translation of Arhat is one who is no longer subject to rebirth. So we already in the previous classes went into the teaching on no birth, no death, which is a way of radically transforming our way of looking at this experience of life. When we no longer are caught in this body, these feelings, these perceptions, these mental formations, this consciousness, then we see that there's just there are enough conditions for life to take place, for experience to take place. But when conditions are no longer sufficient, then that ceases to manifest. But because there's no self there, we cannot talk about somebody dying or being born. We can only see that birth and death are just transformation. So I often like to talk about the French chemist Lavoisier, who had the insight, rien ne se crée, rien ne se perd. Nothing is born, nothing is created, nothing is lost. So he realized in chemical, how many of us learned how to balance chemical equations in high school? I used to love to do that. And so he had this insight that, it has to be balanced. You cannot have matter which is just destroyed, right? Now with relativity, we learn that matter can be and energy are just different forms, right? When it seems like matter is destroyed, it just becomes energy. And energy also can become matter. But there's nothing that is lost. And so the same is true of this body, these feelings. We are recycling ancient water from billions of years ago in this body. And the same is true of the matter of our cells. And so to talk about this, something coming from something and becoming nothing is really ignorant of the actual state of things. And the same is true of our consciousness, right? We learn language, culture, we raised by our parents, and we think, oh, I am this, I am that, I am this individual born on this date, in this place, in this time. But actually, we're just recycling personalities that have continued through history over and over. A little bit different here, a little bit different there, but more or less the same. With anger, sadness, fear, jealousy, worry, all those things. And so when you look at that, we're just part of a current. And so, yeah, so reincarnation is not something mysterious. It's not like some, little bit of ourselves that somehow then goes and is born into another person. Tai said that's a wrong idea. That's a very superficial way of looking at the Buddhist teaching. In fact, what is going on is that we are experiencing the feelings, the perceptions of our ancestors, and they are manifesting in the present moment. And certainly, living in community, you start to see, oh gosh, this brother reminds me of that person, or that one reminds me of this, and so the reality is that we are just remanifesting all the time. We're playing out roles that have been there for thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands of years. And so to talk about this like individual something in us that is somehow unique and separate is a little bit ignorant. Right? It doesn't mean that, it doesn't reduce, in fact it opens up this wondrous experience of the present moment when you get that. When you're no longer attached to this kind of, this self, right? So it's a transformation of consciousness, one who is no longer subject to rebirth. It means that we're no longer attached to all these things we think of as a self. Yeah, so there's no being born and no dying. There's only manifestation. Another translation that I proposed, that also in the tradition, is a destroyer of afflictions. And in previous classes, we talked about afflictions as one of the two main obstacles to our being truly free. It's the obstacle of our afflictions and the obstacle of knowledge. Klesha varana and jneya varana. So, of course, when we're overwhelmed by sadness and despair, it's difficult to be happy. So it's an obstacle to our joy, our freedom. When we're very angry, we're caught in our idea, somebody did something, how could they possibly have done that? That is an affliction. It's limiting our freedom. It's like a cage, a prison. So the Arhat is someone who has learned to cut off their afflictions. Tai talked about three kinds of powers. There's the power of cutting off. Luan Duk in Vietnamese. Usually when we talk about power, we think we want to control, have access to resources, have authority. But in Buddhism we talk about power as cutting off our attachments. So learning that I don't need that. I don't need to keep grasping on. So the same as what we're already talking about with adina adatam, the not taking what's not given. With regards to our emotions, we get sticky about our emotions. We want to recreate those positive emotions that we had. So whether it's a sexual relationship, whether it's a feeling of meaningfulness in our family as maybe a young person, this happy memory, and we just work our whole life just to get our family back together. And if only they could all come back together, we would just be happy like we were back then. And yet maybe that never happens, and even if we do it, we find out we're still not happy because they don't get along with each other like we imagine or we remember. But maybe our memory is actually not, is kind of fuzzy. We're just picking and choosing. And they were not getting along with each other back then either. So this is an attachment to a pleasant feeling. So cutting off, the power of cutting off, helps us to not be overwhelmed by our afflictions. The second power is the power of love. Yeah, so we let go of ideas of punishment, of retribution, and cultivate love. And it's easy to love people who are very kind and generous and friendly. But I think you'll find in this winter retreat, there are people here who are difficult to love. You probably don't know now, but maybe after a few weeks. And so that person can be the object of your cultivation of love. You see, can I learn to love this person? Even they say things that really annoy me, or the way they serve their food, you always think, oh, they eat too much, or whatever it is. You start to see you're just picking on everything that person does. And then you cannot see the lovely aspects of their existence. So true love means the power to love all, to really embrace. And even people who are difficult, people who are violent and aggressive. This is where we get, our power grows. When our capacity to love those who are difficult to love. And the way to do it, I found, is with the third power, which is understanding. I love my brothers in Solidity Hamlet. I love all my brothers around the world, and my sisters. I live closer to the brothers, but we have very different ways of practicing, of living, and so forth. And sometimes I look at my brother, I'm like, what? I'm quite shocked by sometimes. But I learn to understand. Yeah, I see, not everyone has to practice the way I practice. Right now, this is working for me. That's bringing me happiness. That's already enough. And I can just understand that that's where that brother is. And that's not less than me, it's not better than me, it's just where he is in his practice. Some people are progressing quickly on the path. Some people are just going very, very slowly. And that's, with understanding, we can just accept. Yeah, so we increase our capacity to tolerate many ways of approaching the practice. And we don't become judgmental. So the practice is non-discrimination. We learn to look deeply and see that person is there due to their mother and their father, their culture, many generations, and many things, the color of their skin, the wealth of their family, all these things have affected who they are. And if we just let our superficial perceptions take over, we never get to go deep into that person and see their suffering, see all the things that come together as an aggregate into this manifestation today. So the power of understanding is very helpful for cultivating the power of love. And Tai often talks about these three powers, or virtue. He said, just practicing these three, we can touch nirvana. We can let go of our concepts, just through understanding love and cutting off our afflictions, our attachments. And so an Arhat is a title for those practitioners. Many of them were monastics, but not all. Some were lay, that were able to cut off their afflictions, no longer be overwhelmed by despair by anger. Doesn't mean that they didn't have anger, they didn't have despair, because we all have the seed of anger, despair, of violence. But the conditions were no longer sufficient for that anger to manifest in their consciousness, because they no longer believed in their perceptions, you see, as being real. They see that it's only like an illusion passing through, like a magic show. And so they could ride the waves of birth and death without fear. And yeah, the anger doesn't manifest any longer. And also, one other translation, destroyer of the enemy. And the enemy here is our afflictions. Yeah, so this strong language. So we know that as good practitioners, we don't want to suppress our anger, but we no longer continue to nourish it. We no longer continue to feed our despair or our anger. So that is what it means by destroying the enemy. We're no longer, in the metaphor of the flame. Yeah, nirvana is a word that describes the ashes that are cooled after the fire, when there's no longer fuel to give rise to the fire. The flames cannot no longer burn. Yeah, so in this translation of Arhat, it means we destroy the enemy by removing the nourishment, so the flames can no longer burn. Just like we had recently the fire chief, or firefighter, come here and talk with the community who works for the Land Bureau, the Bureau of Land Management. And so he talked to us about fuel near buildings, and he's like, oh, okay, like you have a chair over there, that's fuel. If you have some boxes over there, or you put some wood over there, that's fuel. And we start to look at everything in the monastery as potential fuel for a fire that's passing through. And so the same is true of our concepts. Yeah, we tend to look at it as our concepts as something neutral. Oh, I'm just thinking about that. I'm thinking about this. But if you look deeply, every thought has a tone. Every thought is a potentiality. It is a kind of nourishment for some kind of emotion. And enough thinking like that, and then we start to feel despair. We start to feel anger towards that person. And so mindfulness is being aware in every moment of our thoughts and what the potential of that thought feeding our emotions is. No matter how many times I say that, I still see that it just goes deeper and deeper. Just, okay, wow, there I am again, thinking about that person in a negative way. And that is actually watering my seeds of anger, of sadness, and again. Like, why am I doing that? That's not for my happiness. And it's not for their happiness either. And it's not for their suffering. Maybe sometimes we want to make that person suffer. But we just end up making ourselves always suffer far more than the other person. That's why we need to be very careful with our thinking. So everything we do while we're here in the monastery is to be aware of our thoughts, what's coming up, yeah? And instead, we want to cultivate these powers, like the power of love. Cultivating loving thoughts. It's very funny, as you learn it, you can switch right away. Right away when you have a thought of anger or irritation towards the person, you can just flip it and see the good qualities of that person. It becomes, but when it becomes, when you continue down that road, sometimes Thai call it the Ignoble Path. We have the noble path and the ignoble path. The ignoble path is going to ill-being, and the noble path is a path of happiness. And if we just get in a rut and we just keep feeding our perceptions about that person, and then when the emotion comes up, it's so big that it's not easy to just switch it over to joy and love and happiness, because we've kept going down that road for too long. But when it's just it's just a thought, we can switch very quickly. So I found that the key is to catch it very early, before it continues to feed and becomes like a big bonfire. And then it's very hard to extinguish it. Instead, catch it when it's just a little flame, and then and turn it into a loving thought, a thought of joy. So in the history of the Buddhist tradition, as the communities developed over the years, there came to be the idea that there was, there came to be kind of judgment. Monastics looking at the other ones, oh, he's so lazy. He studies the Buddhist teaching very well, but he doesn't really practice. And so this concept started to come up of different kinds of vehicles. And so you may have heard of the Mahayana. Has anyone never heard of Mahayana? So Mahayana is sometimes described as the vehicle of the Bodhisattva. And it's having a deep aspiration to wake up, not only for ourselves, but for other people. And in the Mahayana tradition, because of this great aspiration to help all beings awaken, a kind of pejorative concept came in, which is of the Hinayana. So we have the Mahayana, which is the great vehicle, and the Hinayana, which is the small vehicle, the lesser vehicle. Hinayana. So Maha is greater and Hina is lesser. And in order to, so the early Mahayanists, some of them, in order to describe a way to practice that is for the benefit of all beings, they sometimes made use of a kind of way of saying, this is not the way to practice. That is a Hinayana practice. It is a lesser practice. It is not the Mahayana. And so the Arhat came to be described as the perfection of the Hinayana, whereas the Bodhisattva was the ideal practitioner of the Mahayana. And so this term, which in source Buddhism described one who has cut off their afflictions, who is worthy of offerings, no longer subject to rebirth, who has realized, often the Buddha said, the one who has done what needs to be done. They no longer need to practice. They are already realized awakening. Over the years, it took on in the Mahayana a kind of pejorative meaning, like somebody who just studies the Buddha's teachings and they know everything, but they just have a lot of knowledge and they just do it for their own awakening and not for the benefit of all beings. Whereas the Bodhisattva is the one who is practicing not only for their own awakening. Even in somewhat later in Mahayana, there were texts that said, I, as a bodhisattva, I will make the vow not to attain complete and total nirvana, but I will stay in the world. There's this idea that somehow if you go into total nirvana, you somehow you just disappear. And you're so awakened that you just don't even, you no longer have any care for the world anymore. And so the Bodhisattva continues to stay in the world. So they keep a little bit of suffering in order to stay and help other people to suffer less. And so whereas those Arhats, they just go and they get awakened right away, and then they're just in bliss all the time, and they don't care about anyone else. They don't transmit their awakening to all beings. Whereas the Bodhisattva, we stay suffering to wake up all living beings. And this is very, very deep in the Mahayana tradition, this way of looking at things. And so this statement, that's why this is such a bold and shocking statement. So you need to know a little bit of the history of Buddhism to understand what Tai is saying here. A real Arhat is also a Bodhisattva. And a real Bodhisattva is also an Arhat. Actually, a Bodhisattva in early Buddhism is the one who's in the research on the early meanings of this term, it seems like in Pali the term is bodhisattva, and that can mean it can mean enlightened being, but it's actually a bit strange. And what has been proposed instead is that it's actually the satta is the verb to lean towards. So it means somebody who's leaning towards enlightenment, someone going in the direction of enlightenment. And that makes more sense for the early Buddhist texts, because the Bodhisattva is how the Buddha referred to himself before he attained complete awakening. He often said, I was still an unenlightened Bodhisattva. But then later on, as the tendency in Buddhism was to kind of turn the teachings into Sanskrit, it was translated into Bodhisattva, and then which is kind of enlightenment being. And then with that came also in the Mahayana a new teaching, a path of a Bodhisattva. So the Mahayana can be described as the path of the Bodhisattva, of awakening. So how can we practice to awaken not only for ourselves, but for all living beings? And so what Tai is saying here is quite radical, that an Arhat is also benefiting all beings. By our practice of mindful breathing, of mindful walking, we are creating an energy which is benefiting not only ourselves, but all people. Tai always wanted in all of our monasteries to have an elder monk or nun. He called the Daiduk Wohan. So the virtuous one, the great virtuous one, who does nothing. They don't have to do anything. They wake up, sweep the hallway, come down for breakfast, for lunch. And they don't have to say anything, they don't have to teach. Just by their presence, they are transforming the space around. And just by they're just being. And they don't have to go to meetings and make decisions in the Bhikshu Sangha or the Dhamma teacher meetings. They don't have to do anything. They can just be there, Daiduk Bohan. Don't do anything. And I wish that all of our centers would have one, elder monk or nun like that. That just doesn't get involved in the daily drama of the monastery, but instead is just there to listen, to understand, to love. Because they've cut off their attachments to power and authority. They're no longer caught. They don't need a role or a title. They don't even need you to call them Daiduk Bohan. Yeah. And that is to help the young monks and nuns and all the lay friends to see that it is not about like getting to be the abbot. It's not about getting to be a Dhamma teacher who's giving the Dhamma talks. It's not about, this kind of attainment, right? It's just about wondrous being, wondrous presence, learning to dwell happily in the present moment, and that's it. So we don't get caught in ideas about, getting a prestigious role or becoming a famous teacher or something like that. So an Arhat like that is also a Bodhisattva. They're also contributing to the peace and the well-being of all living beings. So we need to not get caught into this dialogue that is there in the Mahayana tradition of some lesser path. But you see that the Hinayana is in the Mahayana, and the Mahayana is also in the Hinayana. And the Arhat is also a Bodhisattva, a real Arhat. So the main thing is that, are we really practicing? Or are we just going through the motions? Yeah, are we really transforming our afflictions? Are we really cutting off, learning to love, learning to understand? Or are we just going through the motions of a mindfulness practitioner? Because it looks good on our resume, because we want to be a mindfulness teacher. Or because, we're looking for a romantic partner, and, the best ones are mindfulness practitioners, because they're really kind and friendly, and so we come to the monastery and like, okay, I'll be very kind and friendly, and maybe she'll look at me, and So what is our intention in coming here? We need to look deeply and see that our practice is really true, that we're really here for our happiness, for our well-being. And I think, the reality is it's a mix of both. Yeah, it's not like one is like you're not practicing and one is that you are. But we are human also, and we want to live in community. We want to be recognized. We want to be appreciated. That is our nature. So it's not a bad thing. But we just, we recognize that, and the child within, like earlier in the class this morning, Joanne was sharing with us about how as a child we can have perceptions that we're still following after our whole life. Like just wanting to get our dad's attention and say, oh, good job. And maybe we're working our whole life. Maybe we get a PhD just so dad can say, good job, I'm so proud of you. Just that little moment of, oh, I feel so happy, my dad is proud of me. Actually, we suffered so much getting a PhD. But we did it all just for that moment so dad can say, yeah, I'm so proud of you. But we're not happy. Yeah, so we have to let go of those ideas about attainment and just really focus on dwelling happily in the present moment. Okay, that's enough for today. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a good path of practice. Be a real Arhat. Be a Bodhisattva. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. everyone. I can bring more next week. If you already have one, then I can let others have.